The night I moved in, the house smelled like old paint and other people's unfinished decisions. Boxes stacked in awkward towers, paint cans like tired sentries in a corner. My 3 dogs padding through dust that had been sleeping for years. And even before the gate was bolted shut for the first time, I had that little, stubborn feeling that this place would make me choose between being walked on and putting my foot down. I bought it because the previous owners were family friends who'd had to get out fast, because the price was too good to ignore in the middle of the city, and because I'm the kind of guy who sees potential where others see asbestos and bad wallpaper, so I rolled up my sleeves and put my name on the mailbox. The house was a proper fixer-upper. Not the cute kind you see in renovation shows where bad taste meets charm, but the real rough around the edges kind. A padlocked main door that had never been fitted with a proper lock. Exposed plumbing that looked like someone started a project and gave up midway. And no gate at all at the curb, which in this neighborhood is the same as an open invitation. The first red flag came the very day I moved in. A bike parked in my garage like it had been assigned a spot on the deed. I rolled it onto the street, got a gate installed the same afternoon, and watched a man stand at the curb for 15 minutes, fists balled, trying to decide if he had the right to be annoyed or the right to be outraged. He took the bike and left, but the way he left carried entitlement like a scent. A no parking sign and a few polite but firm words solved the half-hearted driveway invasions. But the neighborhood has a rhythm. Stray dogs, kids who think doorbells double as invitations, the way people assume an empty house is public property. And I learned that rhythm fast. Because life in a city like this is more about adapting than wishing. For a while, that was all it was. Small annoyances, a gate that needed reinforcing, the occasional kid trying the front door like it was a curiosity. Then, one humid morning while I was in the shower, the pressure in the showerhead thinned out like someone turned down the volume on the morning. The water went from a comfortable pour to a trickle, and through the thin plaster I heard the neighbor's pump kick on. That electrical hum that becomes part of a house's soundtrack if you live close enough. And when his pump shut off, my shower came back to life as if nothing had happened. It was a small thing, that first time, easy to chalk up to coincidence, but patterns are patient liars until they reveal themselves. I started paying attention. I checked bills, I inspected pipes, I tightened washers and cursed under my breath at old homeowners who think a little leak is someone else's problem. The house had been empty for years. And yes, unused plumbing does create ghosts, slow leaks, hidden drips, meters that don't tell the full story. Still, the numbers didn't add up. Water's cheap where I live, absurdly cheap for what it is. And my bill, even with 3 dogs, a weekly car wash, and a thirsty garden, should have stayed laughably low. Instead, the meter read like someone else was running a tap when my tank should have been closed. I thought about confrontation. I thought about calling the police and having them cart a grumpy old man to a station, while the neighborhood gossiped behind closed curtains. I thought about knocking on his door with my chest puffed out and my phone recording every syllable. Public humiliation is satisfying in a very human way. But then I looked at him through the window, saw him in his element, a retired mechanic, hands stained with oil, the first floor of his house smelling of metal and memories, and realized how little risk of physical violence there actually was. He was loud and entitled, yes, but not dangerous. That didn't make him right. Entitlement still smells the same whether it wears a cheap suit or a stained coverall. He'd been vocally unhappy the house sold. He'd complained to the previous owners, made threats over cups of chai that didn't change the fact that the property was legally mine. He'd had time to adjust and chose not to. Watching him, I felt that old hot cocktail of emotions. Annoyance, yes, but also a deep, prickly humiliation you get when someone decides your resources are theirs. It wasn't about the money. The math made that clear. It was about agency. It's about someone choosing to help themselves to what you own because they assume you won't notice, because they think you're too new, too alone, or too decent to do anything about it. I replayed the moments when the pressure dipped and returned, the times the pump clicked on next door, the way the hum seemed to sync with my taps. I tested it like a scientist, turning on a faucet and listening, waiting for the neighbor's motor to whine, and then watching the way the meter responded. The pattern hardened into proof. He was siphoning from my supply. For a few days, I let the idea simmer, because the decision had to be clean. Legal action was slow and messy. A heated confrontation could escalate into something ugly. Shaming him online would feel petty and might cross lines I didn't want to cross. I wanted something that would be a precise lesson, scalpel sharp and proportionate. Something that would make him feel the cost of his choice without turning either of us into a headline or a criminal. I didn't want to break into his property or cut wires or do anything that would put me on shaky legal ground. The solution I settled on was simple, almost boring in its elegance. I would cut my own supply at the exact moment his pump fired. No tampering on his side, no illegal entry, just the straightforward removal of what he was taking. It was within my rights, and it was a natural consequence of his action. The way household tanks work here is mechanical and predictable. A float valve in the tank senses water level and tells the pump to run until the tank is full, at which point the valve shuts and the pump turns off. If the level doesn't rise because you're siphoning from someone else's line, the valve stays open and the pump keeps drawing. And anyone who knows motors knows that's bad for a pump if it runs dry, and bad for wiring if it draws too long. I mapped his routine like a careful man mapping the weather. When his tenants tended to shower, when the landlord liked to top up the rooftop tanks, when the neighborhood was quiet enough for a motor's complaints to be heard. I waited through humid nights and hot afternoons, taking notes in my head like a monk noting prayers, until the night came when the timing was perfect. His pump clicked awake at midnight, and I tripped my mains. It was the most satisfying, non-violent act I have ever performed, like flicking off a light at the precise second someone bragged about a favor they hadn't earned. What I did not foresee, or perhaps I underestimated, was how poorly his house's wiring had been maintained. Old houses, like old grudges, hold hidden hazards. The motor's constant draw without water tripped more than the pump. It stressed the wiring, heated joints that had been taped over for decades and slowly, quietly, began to cook the house's electrical tolerance. By 3 a.m, I could hear sounds through the wall. Restless tenants, muffled curses, the distinct shuffle of people who suddenly found their lives inconveniently interrupted. Because when power and water go, life doesn't pause politely. It erupts. I lay in bed listening to my dog settle and thinking about the weight of consequences. I'd chosen a path that kept me clean legally, but I'd also set in motion a chain that would expose negligence and force a reckoning the old man had clearly been avoiding. The moral calculus had felt right in my head. Leave options that preserve dignity, apply pressure that corrects behavior. What came next would not be my doing entirely. People choose their own reactions. But the first part of the story ends where the afternoon did. With me awake in my new house, the window slightly open to the night, the taste of anticipation like metal in my mouth, and a quiet certainty that paying attention had changed the playing field. The motor kept whining long after I fell asleep. And when I woke in the middle of the night to the weird silence of my own taps going dead, it felt like someone had cut the soundtrack to normal life. At first, I lay there, breathing slow, feeling the mattress dip beneath me and listening to the thin click of my ceiling fan, and then the curiosity that had been humming under everything since move-in burned brighter than caution. I padded to the window, peered through the slats, and saw the neighbor's house faintly lit, curtains thrown open, the restless glow of a place where people were suddenly awake and angry. I could hear muffled voices carry across the small gap of yard between us, whispers turning into clipped arguments, a cadence I knew well. Confusion, then accusation, then the heavy silence of people who realize their routine has been ripped away. I made coffee because my head felt like it would do better with caffeine and a plan. And by the time daylight bent on the edges of the street, the neighborhood had rearranged itself into rumors and questions. Tenants asking other tenants what happened. A kid with a bicycle slowing to peer through the locked gate. The particular small-town energy that turns a minor inconvenience into a communal mystery. I wasn't giddy. I felt focused. Revenge that feels good is not the pyrotechnic kind. It's a precise, cold thing that indents your chest and then loosens it when the lesson lands. The fallout came faster than I expected. By mid-morning, 2 of his tenants were standing on the sidewalk, arms crossed and faces tight, complaining about no power and no water, and saying the words that make property owners' ears bleed in our part of the world. This is unacceptable. One of them, a young woman with an infant, was the most furious, and I could see the practical impact on her life writ across her features. No way to sterilize bottles, No hot water for baths, the kind of things money and time fix, but which grind a person's patience down to dust in a hurry. The landlord, the old mechanic, stomped out his front door, hair dishevelled, sleeves rolled, eyes darting like a man who had been woken by catastrophe. He asked loudly if anyone knew why their power was out, and the tenants' answers were, "The kinds that empty rooms." "We called the utility. They said it's only this house. And when will it be fixed?" His voice tried for anger and landed somewhere between pleading and calculation. The police arrived later that day because one tenant filed a complaint. Bureaucracy moves like a sleeping giant, but it moves when nudged the right way. And in our town, officials take essential services complaints seriously because the law makes landlords responsible. When the officer asked questions, I kept my answers simple and factual. Yes, I noticed the pump. Yes, I turned off my mains at midnight because I had a leak. Yes, I had been monitoring the situation for days. The officer scribbled, nodded, and asked to see my meter readings and any photos or videos I had. I had kept a loose log in my phone. Timestamps, the times the pump clicked, the times my shower died. Not out of paranoia, but because it makes sense to keep receipts when someone is messing with your utilities. The small, furious satisfaction of being prepared sunk into me like warmth. Then things got messy for him the way old wiring and unpaid maintenance get messy. An inspector was dispatched, an electrician came, and the reality of decades of taped-over wires and chewed-through insulation came to light. He couldn't blame the neighborhood for the way his house had been patched together with duct tape and sympathy. The failures were his to own. The inspector's notes were clinical and merciless. Overloaded circuits, evidence of prolonged motor run with no cutoff, recommendations that included rewiring sections and replacing the burned-out motor. The law put its thumb on the scale. Fines for failure to provide essential services, mandates to refund security deposits if a landlord fails in his duty, and the cold arithmetic that shows a small fine in one economy is a life-changing expense in another. When the official notice landed on his door, a $500 fine, orders to refund deposits, and a prohibition against re-renting until repairs were certified. The old man looked like someone who'd been punched in slow motion. His posture folded in on itself. The landlord who had swaggered at the curb now shuffled like a man who had just learned his savings were a fiction. I didn't dance in the street or shout about justice. I listened to the way his steps sounded and felt the relief in the marrow of my bones. People around the neighborhood started telling versions of the story that painted him not as a wronged man, but as someone who'd been cutting corners for years. Patched wiring, ignored tenants, a habit of saying he'd fix things next month. Word spreads fast, and in a place where gossip is a currency, reputations change faster than bank accounts. What hit him worst wasn't the money, though that hurt. It was the loss of the tenants. Rent was his safety net. Once that snapped, so did his independence. He came to the gate a few days later, face pressed thin with the practical worries of someone who suddenly had to lean on family. And he asked me in a voice that had tried to sound casual if he had any idea if I'd turned off my mains. I told him I had turned off the water because of a leak and was getting a plumber. And I meant it in the way liars mean things. It was technically true because I had turned off my mains. It was not the whole truth because I'd done so intentionally, to break his cipher. His response was a tight "oh," and then retreat into his house, as if the act of asking drained him of courage. I watched him go with a complicated mix of emotions. Not celebration, exactly. More like the satisfaction you get from closing a wound, knowing you acted within your rights, and that the balance had been restored. After the police paperwork and the inspections, I called a plumber to do what a decent person does. Make sure your home is secure. I needed to remove any illicit connections, to install a proper lock on the tank, to put in one of those tamper-proof fixtures that make siphoning far less tempting. It felt good to take responsible steps, because revenge without responsibility leaves open a door for the next problem. The plumber found a couple of suspicious connections. Small, expertly hidden, the kind of work someone who knows how pipes run could do quietly, and sealed them. He shook his head at the patchwork and told me straight that anyone who'd done that had been intent on avoiding detection. It wasn't just about stinginess, it was about the brazenness of thinking a neighbor's life was public property. Later, while the landlord scrambled to patch his wiring and the tenants debated whether to come back. People came to me in quiet ways. Neighbors who once assumed the house was abandoned now greeted me with nods and small talk, and a woman down the street thanked me for making it clear their block wasn't a free-for-all. I tried to be modest about it, because modesty keeps you human. But I also learned something important about boundaries. The work of maintaining them often has to be done by the person who wants them respected. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood shifted. The old man moved in with his daughter because he could no longer afford to live on his own, and conversations about maintenance and respect popped up in places I never expected. At the barber, at the tea stall, even in passing on the staircase. Some people judged me for the ruthlessness, others praised the justice. I kept reading comments online where someone would call me cruel for taking advantage of a man who was older, or praise me for not letting someone freeload. I read them all and felt neither saint nor sinner, just someone who had chosen a route that preserved legal standing and personal peace. The middle of the story is where the consequences do their work and the emotional heat steadies into a moral temperature you can live with. Tenants lost a home they depended on for comfort. A landlord lost his independence and had to rely on family, and I recovered the quiet of my nights. The sting was immediate, but the lesson it taught lasted. A few weeks passed, and the neighborhood settled into its new rhythm, quieter, cleaner, with that strange emptiness that follows when a noisy chapter finally closes. The old man's house sat dark most nights now, its upper floors still empty, curtains drawn, and that once constant hum of his water pump gone for good. I remember stepping outside one evening to let my dogs run around, the air still warm from the day, and for the first time since moving in, I felt like the place truly belonged to me. No bikes parked in my driveway, no strangers knocking at my gate, no low hiss of water disappearing through stolen pipes. Just calm. It was the kind of peace that doesn't come for free. You earn it by standing your ground, even when doing so makes you the villain in someone else's story. But as I leaned against my gate and watched the streetlights flicker on, I didn't feel like a villain. I felt like someone who had finally balanced the scales. A few days later, I ran into one of the former tenants at a nearby store. She recognized me instantly. The guy next door, the quiet one with the dogs. She laughed a little, said, "You know, we all thought you were just another recluse when you moved in. Turns out you were the only one who knew what was really going on." She wasn't angry. If anything, she seemed almost amused, like she'd heard enough through the grapevine to piece it all together. "He was stealing your water, wasn't he?" she asked, lowering her voice. I didn't lie this time. I just nodded once and said, "Yeah, he was." She looked at me for a moment, then sighed. "He's with his daughter now. She's got him in a smaller place outside town. Probably better for him." Then she smiled faintly. "Guess karma's got its own plumbing system, huh?" That made me laugh more than it should have. Karma's plumbing system. I couldn't have said it better myself. Word around the neighborhood was that the old man tried to fix the wiring himself after the fines hit, but it was too late. The inspector came back, saw that the repairs didn't meet code, and slapped another notice on the door. He couldn't re-rent the place without a full rewire, and that kind of money wasn't in his reach anymore. Eventually, a for sale sign went up, weather-beaten, tilted, and forgotten for weeks before someone finally took it down. I don't know who owns it now, but part of me hopes it goes to someone decent, someone who knows the value of what's theirs and respects what isn't. It's funny. I moved here thinking I'd have to fight the chaos of the city, but it turned out the real chaos was one stubborn old man who thought he could bend the world around his pride. When my plumber came back a second time to check the new piping, he gave a small grin and said, "You're all sealed up now. No one's taking a drop unless you let them." He wasn't talking just about water, and I knew it. There's a deeper satisfaction in revenge that doesn't come from destruction, but from restoration. When you take back what's yours, without becoming as low as the person who took it. I didn't slash his tires or vandalize his property. I didn't even confront him with rage. I simply gave his actions back to him, multiplied by consequences. One evening, maybe a month later, the old man showed up at my gate again. He looked smaller, older, his shoulders sunken like a man who had finally accepted that life had outpaced him. He didn't come to argue. He didn't even ask for anything. He just stood there, fingers gripping the bars of my gate, and said softly, "I shouldn't have done it." There was no defense in his tone, no excuses, just that one quiet truth hanging in the warm air between us. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. All the frustration, all the petty anger I'd felt when I first realized he'd been stealing from me. It all seemed to fade under the weight of those 5 simple words. I just nodded and said, "We all make mistakes. Just make sure you don't repeat this one." He nodded back, a single slow movement, and walked away down the street without another word. That night, I sat on my porch and thought about how revenge stories always look so clean when you tell them. Good guy versus bad guy, right versus wrong, but living them is different. You feel every shade of it. The irritation, the planning, the guilt, and the strange calm after it's over. I wasn't proud of what happened, but I wasn't ashamed either. Sometimes justice wears an ugly face, and sometimes the only way to make someone see their own reflection is to let the consequences do the talking. Weeks turned into months, and the neighborhood became friendlier. Maybe because people finally saw that the house wasn't abandoned anymore. Maybe because they realized there were still folks around who wouldn't be walked over. My dogs loved the new calm. The mornings filled with birds instead of arguments. The nights with silence instead of a droning pump. Every time I turned on my tap and heard that strong rush of water, it reminded me of the balance I'd restored. A small thing, but it felt symbolic. A flow that was finally mine again. Sometimes I'd think back to that first week, when I'd found a stranger's bike parked in my garage and an angry man banging on my gate like he owned the place. How quickly arrogance turns into downfall. How easily a tiny act, just turning off a valve, can unravel a whole web of entitlement. The poetic part of me liked to think that life itself had flipped a switch that day, that maybe I was just the instrument of the lesson. Now, when people ask if I believe in karma, I tell them this story. Not to brag, but to remind them that karma isn't some mystical force that appears out of nowhere. Sometimes, karma is you, quietly taking control of a situation, refusing to be taken advantage of, and letting someone else's greed destroy them on its own. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just clicks, like a valve shutting tight. So yeah, maybe it wasn't the grand movie-style revenge some people dream of. There were no confrontations, no shouting matches, no dramatic showdowns. Just patience, precision, and a little twist of irony. But in the end it worked. The thief lost what he valued most: his comfort, his control, his reputation. And I gained something better than revenge. Peace. Real peace. The kind that seeps into your bones and stays there. As I sit here now, telling you this story, I realize revenge isn't always about destruction. Sometimes it's about correction. Sometimes it's about reminding the world that decency still has teeth. And when you finally stand up for yourself, calmly, cleverly, and within your rights, the world takes notice. People learn, boundaries reset, and you can finally sleep at night without wondering who's stealing from your line. So if you ever find yourself wronged, not just irritated, but genuinely wronged, remember this: you don't have to shout. You don't have to fight dirty. Just be smarter, steadier, and let time and truth do the heavy lifting. Because sooner or later, everyone drinks from their own well. And if they've been stealing from yours, well, the day always comes when the water runs dry.